The sound of a wagon wheel dying is something you never forget. It isn't a clean break. It's a dry, hollow snap. The sound of seasoned oak giving up after 1,000 miles of alkali dust and relentless Wyoming heat. It's a sound that marks the exact moment a journey comes to a dead stop in the middle of nowhere. For Edgar Talbot, standing in a kitchen that smelled of nothing but 2 years of silence and the cold ash of a dead hearth, that sound was the only thing louder than the beating of his own heart. He was 31 years old, but as he stood there looking at the peeling wallpaper and the dust that had settled over his mother's favorite porcelain like a thin, gray shroud, he felt like a man of 80. He was done. The papers were already in the inside pocket of his coat, the heavy, official-feeling documents from the Harlan Land Company in Cheyenne. They were the papers that would turn the Talbot Ranch, a place built board by his father's calloused hands in 1858, into a line of figures on a corporate ledger. He was ready to vanish. He was ready to let the land he had bled for become someone else's problem. But then across the yard, past the gate that leaned on tired hinges that would snapped. The ranch gate was 200 yards from the road, and Edgar was on his roan gelding, Buck, before he had consciously decided to move. It was instinct, a remnant of the man he used to be when the Talbot name meant something more than a dwindling herd and a mountain of debt. He crested the rise and saw the scene exactly as the sound had described it. A medium-sized covered wagon had veered off the hard-packed road into the softer gravel of the shoulder. The rear right wheel had shattered against a buried rock, and the wagon sat canted at a miserable, dangerous angle. The canvas cover was pulled tight, hiding whatever life was being transported within, but the single bay horse harness to the front stood ears flat and steady. That told Edgar something immediately. Whoever was driving new horses, they had trained that animal to stay calm when the world was literally tilting beneath its hooves. The driver was a woman. She had already climbed down from the seat and was standing by the broken wheel, her hands on her hips. She wasn't weeping. She wasn't pacing in circles or looking toward the horizon for a savior. She was surveying the damage with an expression of controlled, tactical frustration. She looked to be 27, maybe 28, dressed in a dark blue traveling dress that had seen better days, shielded by a canvas duster that was thick with the grime of the trail. Her hair was the color of deep river mud after a heavy rain, pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that was as weathered as the landscape. There was no softness in the line of her jaw. As Edgar pulled Buck to a sliding halt, her eyes met his, not with alarm, but with a steady, assessing gaze that made him feel like he was the one being measured. "That is a problem," she said. Her voice was lower than he expected, resonant and calm. "It is," Edgar agreed, swinging down from the saddle. He felt the weight of the sale papers in his pocket. They felt like a cold stone against his chest, a secret shame. "Edgar Talbot. My property starts at that gate there." "Louise Bishop," she replied, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, the kind of grip that comes from a lifetime of working for every mile traveled. "I appreciate you coming so quickly, Mr. Talbot. I don't suppose you know where I might find a wheelwright." "Nearest one is Henry Sparks in Millhaven," Edgar told her. "It's 4 miles east. But we have a more immediate concern. That wagon is top-heavy, and if we don't get it level, the rest of those spokes are going to go, and you'll lose whatever you have loaded inside." "What have you got in there, if you don't mind my asking?" Louise looked at the tilting canvas, then back at him. "Everything I own," she said simply, "which is not very much, but it is all I have." There is a weight to a statement like that. It's the kind of honesty that doesn't ask for pity, only for acknowledgement. Have you ever felt like everything you were, your past, your future, your very name, was balanced on a single, breaking point? Have you ever reached the end of your rope only to find someone else standing there, holding theirs? Tell me in the comments. Have you ever had a moment where a complete stranger appeared just as you were about to give up on everything? Edgar nodded, looking at the slope of the ground. "There's a flat stretch inside my gate. If we can get your horse moving and I walk beside it to balance the load with my shoulder, we can limp it to that spot before the whole thing tips. Then I'll ride for Sparks." Louise didn't deliberate. She didn't have the luxury of time, and she seemed to know it. "All right," she said. "Let's do that." The next 10 minutes were a blur of physical strain, and the smell of hot axle grease and horse sweat. Edgar put his shoulder against the high side of the wagon, his boots digging into the loose gravel as he fought to keep the center of gravity from shifting. Every rotation of the remaining wheels sent a shudder through his frame. Beside him, Louise guided the bay horse, speaking in a low, rhythmic hum that kept the animal from bolting despite the grinding screech of the broken wheel. By the time they reached the level ground near his barn, Edgar's shirt was soaked through with effort. His right shoulder ached with a dull, throbbing heat, but for the first time in 2 years, he felt the blood moving in his veins. He felt useful. "I'll ride for Sparks," he said, wiping his face with a bandana. "It'll be 2 hours at least before he can get out here. You're welcome to water your horse at the trough. There's shade by the porch." "Thank you, Mr. Talbot," Louise said. She was already unhooking the harness, her movements methodical and practiced. "I hope I'm not delaying you from somewhere important." Edgar's hand went to his coat pocket. He felt the crisp edge of the contract that would have ended his life as a rancher by noon. Curtis Feld, the man from the Harlan Company, was waiting for him in Millhaven. The clock was ticking on the Talbot legacy. "Nothing that can't wait," Edgar lied. He rode into Millhaven at a canter, but he didn't go to the land office first. He found Henry Sparks at his shop, arranged for the repair, and then, moved by an impulse he couldn't name, he stopped at the general store. He bought a small paper sack of coffee beans. He hadn't restocked his own kitchen in months, living on whiskey and hardtack, but the thought of offering Louise Bishop a cup of dust felt like an insult he couldn't bear. He was a man with a signed surrender in his pocket, yet he was buying coffee like a host. When he returned to the ranch, he found that Louise hadn't stayed in the shade. She had found the old outdoor water pump near the barn. She was pumping with a steady rhythm, filling not just her horse's trough, but also the empty rain barrel near the side of the house, a barrel that had sat dry and hollow since the previous autumn. "You do not have to do that," Edgar said, dismounting. "I know," Louise replied, not breaking her rhythm. "But your barrel was empty, and this pump works fine. Seemed wasteful not to." She looked at him then, her eyes taking in the ranch, the sagging fence lines, the overgrown garden, the house that looked like it was trying to sink into the earth. She didn't look at it with judgment. She looked at it the way a doctor looks at a patient who has stopped trying to live. "I grew up on a ranch in Colorado," she said, answering the question he hadn't asked. "Garfield County. I know what a rain barrel is for, and I know when a place is thirsty." They stood in a silence that didn't feel like a void, but a bridge. Edgar brought her a cup of the fresh coffee when it was ready, and they stood on the porch, watching the light shift over the mountains. She told him she was headed for a boarding house in Millhaven to work with her cousin, only to find out through a letter that arrived too late that her cousin's husband had died and the house was closed. She was heading toward a home that no longer existed. "So," she said, looking in her cup, "Millhaven is where I am going, but I'm not entirely certain what I'm going to do when I get there." Edgar looked at the sale papers on the kitchen table inside the door. He thought about the man he had been an hour ago, a man who was ready to run. And he looked at the woman who had nothing left but a broken wagon and a steady hand, and yet she was filling his rain barrels. If you're ready for this epic journey and want to see how these two lost souls rebuild what was broken, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. This story is just beginning, and we want to know who is gathered around our digital campfire. Hit the like button, subscribe to Redwood Chronicle, and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter of this frontier saga. Your support is the wood that keeps this fire burning. The coffee wasn't just coffee. For Edgar, it was a bridge. He sat on the porch step, the wood groaning under his weight, and watched the steam rise from his tin cup. For the first time in years, the silence of the Talbot ranch didn't feel like a heavy, suffocating shroud. It felt like a pause. Louise Bishop sat in the rocking chair behind him, his mother's chair, and she didn't rock. She sat with a stillness that was active, her eyes never stopping as they scanned the horizon, the barn, and the dry, cracked earth of the vegetable garden. She wasn't just looking at the scenery. She was reading the history of his failure, and for some reason, Edgar didn't want to look away. "You have good bones here, Mr. Talbot," she said, her voice cutting through the evening air like a soft bell. "My father used to say you can tell a man's soul by the way he keeps his fences. Yours are tired, but they aren't broken beyond repair. They're just waiting. Edgar gripped his cup tighter. The sale papers in his pocket felt like they were burning a hole through his coat. The land is done, Miss Bishop. The creek is low, the grass is brown, and the market is even drier than the dirt. I was about to head into town to sign it all away. I'm a man who knows when a fight is lost. He turned to look at her, expecting to see pity. Instead, he saw a spark of something that looked dangerously like defiance in her dark eyes. Is it the fight that's lost, or the fighter? She asked. It was a blunt question, the kind that usually earn a man a cold shoulder or a quick exit. But coming from her, it felt like an invitation. Have you ever had someone look past all your excuses and see the truth you were trying to hide from yourself? Tell me in the comments. Has there ever been a person in your life who challenged you to be better just by asking the right question at the absolute worst time? Before Edgar could answer, the sound of a fast-approaching rider echoed from the road. It wasn't the slow, heavy gait of a workhorse. It was the rhythmic, arrogant thud of a high-bred stallion. Edgar stood up, his hand instinctively dropping to the belt where his father's colt usually hung, though he wasn't wearing it today. A man in a desaturated gray suit, wearing a hat that had never seen a day of real work, pulled up at the gate. It was Curtis Feld, the man from the Harlan Land Company, the man who represented Edgar's escape. Talbot, Feld shouted, not bothering to dismount. He looked at the covered wagon parked near the barn with a sneer of professional annoyance. I expected you at the office 2 hours ago. My time isn't as cheap as this dirt you're sitting on. Did you bring the signed documents? Or are we going to have to adjust the offer for the delay? Edgar felt a coldness settle in his gut. The reality of his decision was standing at his gate, smelling of expensive tobacco and impatient greed. He looked at Feld, then he looked back at Louise. She had stood up, too. She didn't say a word, but her presence was like a pillar of stone. She looked at the man in the suit with the same assessing gaze she had used on the broken wagon wheel. The wheelwright is on his way, Mr. Feld, Edgar said, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. I had a traveler in distress. The papers are inside. Distress. Feld laughed, a short, sharp sound. You're worrying about a broken wheel when your entire future is on the line? Don't be a fool, Edgar. Sign the papers, take the money, and get out of this dust bowl before the bank does it for you for nothing. Who is this woman? A relative? She's a guest on Talbot land, Edgar said, and for the first time in years, he felt a surge of the old Talbot pride, the kind that didn't take kindly to city men barking orders on his porch. And Talbot land still belongs to me until I say otherwise. Feld's eyes narrowed. He looked at Louise, then back at Edgar. You have until tomorrow morning, Talbot. If you aren't in my office by 9 with those signatures, the offer drops by 20%. Think about that while you're playing hero. He jerked the reins of his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of fine, white dust hanging in the air. The silence that followed was different. It was charged. Louise walked to the edge of the porch, watching the dust settle. He's a vulture, she said quietly. He doesn't want your ranch, Mr. Talbot. He wants the space it occupies. He doesn't see the grass or the cattle. He sees a line on a map. He sees the truth, Edgar muttered, turning back toward the door. I'm broke, Miss Bishop. I have 4 cows left that are mostly bone and a house that's forgetting it was ever a home. That man is offering me a way to start over where the rain actually falls. Is it starting over if you're leaving a piece of your heart in the ground here? Louise asked. She walked toward the pump again, the one she had used to fill his rain barrel. She put her hand on the cold iron. You told me you grew up here. You told me your father built this. Do you think he'd want you to sell it to a man who wouldn't know a calving season from a card game? Edgar didn't answer. He couldn't. He went inside and slammed the door, leaning his forehead against the cool wood of the entry. He looked at the kitchen table. The papers were there, lying in a pool of late afternoon sunlight. They looked like a surrender flag. Through the window, he watched Louise. She wasn't waiting for him. She was back at the pump. She was pumping again, the rhythm steady and relentless. Asterisk clack-hiss. Clack-hiss. Asterisk she was filling the buckets she had found in the barn. Then, he watched in bewilderment as she carried those heavy buckets over to the dry, dead kitchen garden. She wasn't watering for a harvest. She was watering to keep the soil from blowing away. She was tending to a ghost. Edgar watched her for a long time. He watched the way her muscles strained under her duster, the way she didn't complain about the weight, and the way she moved with a purpose that he had lost somewhere between his mother's funeral and the last dry winter. He felt a sting of something that wasn't quite shame and wasn't quite hope. It was a recognition. He walked out onto the porch again. Why are you doing that? There's nothing left in that dirt to grow. Louise straightened up, wiping a stray hair from her forehead with a damp hand. Her face was flushed with effort. Maybe not today, but if you let the dirt die, nothing will ever grow here again. Even if you sell it, don't you want to leave it better than you found it? Or are you the kind of man who lets the fire go out just because the wood is damp? Edgar felt the challenge like a physical blow. He walked down the steps, his boots crunching on the gravel. He walked over to the pump, reached out, and took the handle from her hand. His hand brushed hers. It was warm and rough and real. "I'll do the pumping," he said. "You carry the buckets." They worked in silence for an hour. The sun dipped lower, turning the Wyoming sky into a bruised purple and gold. They watered the garden, the base of the thirsty cottonwoods, and the thirsty trough in the paddock. They worked until the stars began to wink into existence above the Bighorn Mountains. By the time they stopped, Edgar's arms were leaden, but his mind was clear. The big question wasn't whether he was going to sell the ranch. It was whether he could live with himself if he did. As they walked back to the house, Louise stopped and looked at the barn. "Tomorrow, the wheel will be fixed. I'll be out of your way, Mr. Talbot. I'm sorry if I've caused you trouble with your business in town." "You haven't caused trouble, Louise," Edgar said, using her name for the first time. It felt right. "You've just reminded me of the weather." "The weather?" "Yeah, the way the wind changes right before a storm breaks. You can feel in your bones before you see the clouds." Louise smiled then, a real, genuine smile that transformed her face, softening the hard lines of the trail. "Sometimes the storm is what clears the air, Edgar." She went into the small guest room off the kitchen that he had offered her. Edgar stayed in the main room. He picked up the sale papers. He looked at the signature line. He thought about Curtis Feld and his gray suit. Then he thought about the sound of the water hitting the dry dirt of the garden. He didn't sign them, but he didn't tear them up either. He put them in the top drawer of his father's desk and closed it with a decisive click. If you've ever reached a point where you felt like your legacy was slipping through your fingers, you know the weight of Edgar's night. We're building something special here at Redwood Chronicle, a community of people who value the grit and the heart of the Old West. If this story is speaking to you, if you want to see if Edgar finds the strength to stay, show your support. Hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to change the plan. And before we move on to the morning, I want to ask you, have you ever made a decision to walk away from something only to have a single moment or a single person change your mind? What was that broken wheel in your life? Let's talk about it in the comments. Henry Sparks arrived at 2:30, his own heavy work wagon kicking up a plume of fine, white silt that hung in the stagnant afternoon air. Sparks was a stocky, efficient man, the kind of man whose hands were permanently stained with axle grease and whose skin had been cured like leather by 40 years of Wyoming sun. He didn't waste words on greetings. He simply looked at the shattered wheel, looked at Louise, and then at Edgar. He knew Edgar was supposed to be in town. He knew the Talbot Ranch was a sinking ship, but he also knew the look of a man who was standing his ground, even if he didn't know why yet. Edgar stood back, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, as Sparks worked. Beside him, Louise watched the repair with a focus that was entirely professional. She wasn't standing there like a helpless passenger. She was anticipating Sparks' needs, handing him a mallet or a wedge before he even had to ask. Edgar watched the interplay, the quiet competence of two people who understood that in this country, your equipment was your life. The most striking moment came when the job was finished. As Sparks wiped his hands on a greasy rag and named his price, Louise reached into the small leather purse she kept on a cord at her waist. Edgar watched her fingers, slender but strong, as she counted out the coins. She was deliberate, precise. He saw the way she hesitated over the last few bits of silver, a split-second calculation that told him everything he needed to know about her margin for error. She wasn't just a traveler. She was a woman living on the knife's edge of her own independence. Every cent was a mile. Every nickel was a meal. "What do I owe you, Mr. Talbot?" she asked, turning to him as Sparks drove away. "Nothing," Edgar said, the word coming out faster than he intended. "I don't take charity, Edgar," she said, her voice holding that steady, grounded weight again. "It isn't charity," he countered, looking at the rain barrel she had filled. "You fill my barrel. In this country, water is currency. A rain barrel is worth a hell of a lot more than the time I spent riding into town." Louise held his gaze for a long beat. He felt the sale papers in his pocket like a physical weight, a secret that made his offer feel hollow. But Louise didn't see the papers. She saw the man who had put his shoulder to her wagon. She saw the man who had bought fresh coffee because she was there. "Call it good neighborly conduct, then," Edgar added, trying to soften his tone. "I haven't had a reason to practice it in a while. Let me have this one." A small smile touched the corner of her mouth. Barely there, but enough to change the temperature of the conversation. "All right," she said. "Thank you, Edgar." Then came the part he hadn't prepared for. She climbed up onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins. The bay horse, Clem, shifted expectantly. The wagon, now level and sturdy, looked ready for 1,000 more miles. "It was a pleasure to meet you," she said. "I hope things go well for you here." She clicked to the horse, and the wagon moved forward. Edgar stood at his gate and watched the dust settle. He watched until the white canvas of her wagon disappeared around the curve of the road toward Millhaven. And then, the silence of the Talbot ranch returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. Before, it had been a silence of absence, of people gone and dreams died. Now, it was a silence of haunting. The porch felt emptier. The air felt stiller. The rain barrel, full to the brim, sat as a mocking reminder that the land was still there, and it was still thirsty. Have you ever had a moment where someone entered your life for just a few hours, only to leave a silence that felt louder than a thunderstorm? Tell me in the comments, what is the hardest goodbye you've ever had to say to someone you barely knew? Edgar didn't ride into town to see Curtis fell that day. He told himself he was too tired. The next morning, he told himself the road was too muddy after a light midnight drizzle. By the third day, he had stopped making excuses to himself. He took the sale papers out of his pocket and put them on the kitchen table. He didn't file them. He didn't sign the last page. He just walked around them. He treated those papers like a sleeping mountain lion. If he didn't disturb them, maybe they wouldn't finish him off. But he couldn't stop thinking about Louise Bishop. He thought about the way she looked at the land, not as a failure, but as something that was resting. He thought about her standing on the porch of a boarding house that didn't exist anymore. On the fourth day, he couldn't take the silence. He saddled Buck and rode into Millhaven. He didn't go to the land office. He rode past the brick building where Curtis Feld sat waiting with his gold watch and his Vulture's grin. He went to the general store and spoke to Old Man Gibbs. "Stranger came through a few days back," Edgar said, trying to sound casual as he looked at a bin of nails. "Woman with a bay horse and a covered wagon. Broke a wheel on my road. You happen to know if she found a place to stay?" Gibbs, who had seen Edgar grow from a boy into a man who carried the world on his shoulders, leaned over the counter. "Second floor at Mrs. Harrow's, south end of town. Though if you're looking for her, you'd best be quick. I hear she's looking for work, and there isn't much for a woman alone in Millhaven unless she wants to scrub floors or wait tables." Edgar thanked him and walked out into the sunlight. He stood on the boardwalk for 5 minutes, the inner conflict nearly paralyzing him. He was a man with a dying ranch and a pocket full of surrender. What right did he have to seek out a woman who was trying to build a future? He was a man of the past. She was a woman of the what's next. He went anyway. Mrs. Harrow's was a neat white house with a small porch and a row of wilting geraniums in the windows. Louise was there, sitting in a rocking chair with a mending basket on her lap. She looked up as he dismounted, and the expression that crossed her face was a map of surprises. For a second, her composure slipped, and he saw a flash of genuine pleasure before she masked it with her trail-hardened steadiness. "Mr. Talbot," she said. "Miss Bishop," he replied, hanging his hat on his knee as he sat on the porch step. "I was in town for supplies. Thought I'd see how you were settling." "That's kind of you." She went back to her mending, her needle moving with the same precision she'd used on the wagon wheel. Millhaven is quiet, different from Colorado. They talked for an hour. He told her more about the ranch, and this time he didn't talk about the debt or the drought. He talked about his father building the barn. He talked about the way the cottonwoods turned silver in the moonlight. And for the first time, Louise began to ask questions that went deeper than polite conversation. "That creek on your north boundary," she said, looking up from a shirt collar she was repairing. "Does it run in the dry months? Or is it just a spring-fed hope?" "It holds," Edgar said, surprised by the question. "Deep pools near the rocks stay cool, even in August." "In the eastern section?" she asked. "Does the winter sun hit the grass there? Or does the shadow of the ridge kill the grazing?" These weren't the questions of a traveler. They were the questions of someone who understood the mechanics of survival. "You work your father's ranch, didn't you?" Edgar asked. Louise stopped her needle. She looked out at the main street of Millhaven, but her eyes were seeing somewhere else. "My mother died when I was 9. It was just my father and me. I worked the cattle, I worked the fences, and I worked the books. When he sold it 4 years ago, he thought he was doing me a favor. He thought he was giving me a lady's life in town. But he didn't realize that being inside with fabric and thread, it makes a person feel smaller. I missed the smell of the morning before the world woke up. I missed the way the dirt feels when it's actually got a purpose." She looked back at Edgar, and the space between them on that small porch felt like a bridge spanning a canyon. "The boarding house was a door that turned out to be a wall," she said. "But I'm still glad I walked toward it. Because if I hadn't, I wouldn't have seen your rain barrel." Edgar felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in a decade. It was the possibility of hope. It was the realization that he wasn't the only one who felt the suffocation of a life that didn't fit. If you've ever felt like you were trapped in a life that was too small for you, like you were a person meant for the open range but stuck behind a desk or a counter, then you know this suffocation Louise was describing. We want to hear your story. Drop a comment below and tell us. What was the open range of your dreams that you're still trying to reach? Let's support each other in keeping those dreams alive. Edgar rode home that evening with his head spinning. He walked into his kitchen and looked at the sale papers. He picked them up, his thumb brushing the signature line. Curtis Feld wanted an answer. The Holland Land Company wanted the Talbot dirt. But as Edgar looked out the window at the garden Louise had watered, he didn't see a wasteland anymore. He saw a project. He saw a resting place. He put the papers in the top drawer of his father's desk and closed it with a snap that echoed through the empty house. He wasn't ready to burn them yet, but he wasn't ready to sign them either. The next day, he went back to town. He had a plan that was either the smartest thing he'd ever done or the final nail in his coffin. The morning of the 5th visit to town, the Wyoming sky was a hard, brilliant blue that seemed to press down on the ridges of Powder River County with the weight of a physical hand. Edgar Talbot didn't look at the sky as he rode. He looked at the ears of his horse, Buck, and he thought about the top drawer of his father's desk. The papers were still there. They were becoming a part of the house now, like the peeling wallpaper or the creak in the 3rd step. But they were a part that didn't belong. Every time he walked past that desk, he felt a phantom itch in his palm. The urge to either grab the pen and end the misery or grab a match and end the lie. He found Louise behind the counter at the Millhaven Mercantile. The store smelled of brine, unrolled bolts of calico, and the sharp, metallic tang of new hardware. She was bent over a ledger, her handwriting precise, shaded, and surprisingly elegant, filling the lines with the cold mathematics of survival. She looked up when the bell above the door chimed, and for a split second, before she could pull her trail face back into position, Edgar saw her eyes brighten. It was a look of uncomplicated welcome, and it hit him harder than a kick from a mule. "I hear you found work," Edgar said, leaning against the counter. He felt clumsy in the presence of her efficiency, a big man made of dust and hesitation standing in front of a woman made of ink and resolve. 3 mornings a week, Louise confirmed, setting her pen in the inkwell with a click. Mr. Gilly needed someone who could manage accounts without losing a nickel to the floorboards. "It helps with the rent at Mrs. Harrow's. I am a woman who prefers to keep her own ledger balanced, Mr. Talbot." Edgar looked at her hands. They were clean now, the dirt of his ranch washed away, but he remembered the way they had looked gripped around the handle of his pump. He remembered the way she had carried those buckets to his dying garden. He had spent the entire 4-mile ride rehearsing a speech, but looking at her now, the words felt like dry husks. He decided, then and there, to do what he had always done when the trail got steep. He simply leaned into the harness. "I have a lot that needs doing at the ranch, Louise," he said. The use of her first name in the quiet of the store felt like a secret they were sharing in front of the shelves of canned peaches. "The east fence line is down in 3 sections. The root cellar is flooding because the drainage is blocked. The kitchen garden, well, you saw the garden. It's been sitting empty for 2 years, and it ought to have something growing in it before the season runs too long. I have a filly in the back paddock that needs gentling before she's fit for a saddle." He stopped, his heart hammering a rhythm against his ribs that he hoped she couldn't hear. "I know that's a list of problems. It isn't a pretty picture. But I also know you're a woman who knows ranch work, and I suspect you're a woman who would rather be smelling the sagebrush than the floor wax in here. I'm asking if you'll come out and help me. As a paid hand. A fair wage for fair work." Louise was quiet for a long time. She didn't look at him. She looked at the ledger. She straightened the corner of a page. The big question wasn't just about the work. It was about the intention. In 1883, a man asking a woman to work his ranch alone was a statement that carried its own set of shadows. "How long?" she asked. "As long as you're willing," Edgar said. "And as long as the work holds." She looked up then, her gaze a level, measuring weight. "I will speak to Mr. Gilly about keeping my mornings here," she said. "And I will come to the ranch in the afternoons. But I want one thing understood before I agree, Edgar." "What's that?" "I am not a woman who works for wages and also for other things unstated," she said, her voice steady and devoid of heat. "I need to know that what you're offering is exactly what you said it is. Work, a fair wage, no strings, no expectations that don't involve a fence tool or a hoe." It was a direct question asked with complete dignity, and it deserved a response that didn't flinch. Edgar met her eyes. "That is exactly what I'm offering. You have my word. If at any point you feel otherwise, you tell me, and you stop coming. I will have failed to keep my word, and that is not something I intend to do." Louise held his gaze for 3 more seconds, a lifetime in a small town, and then she nodded. "Then yes," she said, "I will come." She arrived the following afternoon on her bay horse, Clem. She wasn't wearing the blue traveling dress. She was wearing canvas work trousers, a man's work shirt tucked tight, and her hair was braided and pinned so severely it looked like armor. She looked perfectly at ease, as if she had been born to stand in the middle of a Wyoming cow lot. She didn't wait for a greeting. She rolled up her sleeves, looked at the horizon, and asked, "Where do we start?" They started at the east fence. It was brutal, backbreaking labor. The Talbot land was rocky there, the soil reluctant to give up space for the new posts. They worked side by side in a rhythm that usually takes years to develop between 2 people. Edgar would swing the heavy iron post-hole digger, his muscles bunching and straining, while Louise readied the cedar posts, stripping the bark where it had begun to rot. When the post was in, she was the one who tamped the soil, her movements precise and rhythmic, her weight shifting with a grace that made the labor look like a dance. They didn't talk much. In the West, talk is often just a way to waste breath you need for the work. But the silence wasn't empty. It was a shared silence of competence. Every time Edgar reached for a tool, Louise was already holding it out. Every time he moved to stretch the wire, she was already at the next post, bracing it. On the 3rd afternoon, the heat was a shimmering veil over the valley. They sat on the top rail of the fence they had just finished, their shirts stained with the gray dust of the Talbot Hills. Edgar looked out over the expanse of his land, his failing ranch, and for the first time, the view didn't make him want to close his eyes. "This is good land, Edgar," Louise said, wiping sweat from her temple with the back of her hand. It was, Edgar said, the old habit of defeat pulling at his voice. "It still is," she corrected him firmly. "It hasn't gone anywhere." The land doesn't move. It has just been resting. It's been waiting for someone to remember why it matters. Edgar looked at her profile. The straight line of her nose, the strength in her jaw, the way she held herself like she belonged to the earth rather than just occupied it. Do you really believe that? That a place can come back from being neglected? That a man can? Louise turned and looked at him. Her eyes were dark and full of a deep, quiet light. I think most things can come back, Edgar, if the right attention is paid to them at the right time. The land is patient. It has more time than we do. The question is never if the land is ready. It's if the man is. She was talking about the fence. She was talking about the garden. But Edgar felt the words settle into the cracks of his heart like seeds. Have you ever felt like you were just resting, waiting for someone to see the potential in you that you'd forgotten you had? Tell me in the comments. Have you ever been neglected by life, only to have someone show up and remind you that your good bones were still there? The sun began to dip behind the bighorns, casting long, dramatic shadows across the grass. Edgar realized then that he hadn't thought about the Harlan Land Company once in 3 days. He hadn't thought about California. He hadn't thought about vanishing. He was thinking about the drainage in the root cellar. He was thinking about what seeds Louise might want for that garden. You should stay for supper, Edgar said as the light turned gold. It's a long ride back to town on an empty stomach. I don't want to be a burden, Mr. Talbot. You're a paid hand, Louise, and a paid hand on this ranch gets fed. That's the code. She smiled, that soft, rare smile that always seemed to catch him off guard. All right, she said. I'll stay, but I'm doing the cooking. I've seen your kitchen, Edgar. You've been eating like a man who expects to disappear. It's time you ate like a man who intends to stay. Coming into the house that evening was different. Usually, the kitchen was a cold, hollow place that echoed with his own footsteps. But as the sun went down, the room began to fill with the smell of salt pork, fried potatoes, and the sharp, clean scent of the coffee he'd bought because of her. Louise moved through his mother's kitchen with a quiet authority, her sleeves still rolled up, her braid loosening slightly from its pins. Edgar sat at the table and watched her. He felt a peace that was almost frightening in its intensity. He thought about the papers in the desk drawer. He realized that the fair wage wasn't just the coins in her purse. It was the life she was breathing back into the timber and stone of the Talbot name. If you're moved by this story of a man rediscovering his purpose through the eyes of a stranger, show your support for the traditions of the frontier. Hit that like button to help this story reach others who might be feeling lost in their own dry season. Your engagement helps us keep the history of the West alive. And before we move into the night, I have to ask you, Edgar is beginning to see his home differently, but the papers are still in that drawer. Do you think he's truly changed his mind, or is he just delaying the inevitable? What would you do if you were standing in his dusty boots? The morning air smelled of wet stone and the sharp, medicinal tang of crushed sage. For the first time in years, Edgar Talbot didn't wake up to the sound of his own breathing in an empty house. He woke up to the sound of a pump handle rhythmically striking iron and the distant, muffled neigh of a bay horse. It was a sound that didn't just fill the silence, it challenged it. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling of the room his father had built, and realized that the plan, the one involving Cheyenne, California, and vanishing, was beginning to feel less like a rescue and more like a betrayal. He reached for his boots, and, as he pulled them on, his eyes drifted toward the top drawer of the desk. The sale papers were in there, a cold, silent ghost waiting for its turn to speak. But today, the land was speaking louder. Louise was already in the kitchen when he came downstairs. She didn't look like a guest, and she certainly didn't look like a hired hand. She looked like a part of the house that had been missing for a decade. She had found a crate of his mother's old jars in the pantry, jars that had been thick with the dust of 2 years of mourning, and she had washed them. They sat on the counter now, sparkling in the early light like gems found in a ruin. She was standing by the stove, her sleeves rolled up, her hair already braided with that severe, beautiful efficiency. The root cellar is worse than I thought, Edgar, she said, not looking up from the cast iron skillet. The standing water isn't just a leak. The entire drainage line is choked with silt from the last big thaw. If we don't clear it before the summer rains come, the foundation on the north side is going to start settling. And once a house starts to lean, it never really stops. She spoke about the house the way a general speaks about a fortress. It wasn't just a building to her. It was a living thing that was being neglected. Edgar sat at the table. The same table where he'd sat with a bottle of whiskey and a pen just weeks ago, and felt a strange, jarring sense of alignment. He had been looking at the house as a burden to be sold. She was looking at it as a life to be saved. "I'll get the shovels after breakfast," Edgar said. "But that silt is packed hard. It's a two-man job, and I only have one pair of hands that are used to that kind of muck." "You have 4 hands, Edgar," Louise said, finally looking at him. Her eyes were steady, reflecting the gold of the morning sun. "And I've cleared more drainage ditches in the Colorado winters than you've had hot meals this month. We'll do it together." They spent the morning in the dark, cool dampness of the root cellar. It was a space that usually held nothing but the smell of rot and old earth. But as they worked, the air began to change. They were shoulder to shoulder in the narrow trench, the sound of metal biting into wet clay echoing against the stone walls. It was intimate work, the kind that forces 2 people to move in a shared geography. Every time their shoulders brushed, Edgar felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with the labor. He saw the way the lamplight played over the curve of her neck, the way she didn't flinch at the mud or the cold. "Why do you care so much about this place, Louise?" Edgar asked, his voice low in the confined space. "You're a traveler. You have a wagon and a horse. You could be in Millhaven or Cheyenne or anywhere else where the floors are clean and the work is light." Louise stopped, her shovel resting against her boot. She looked at the damp stone wall, her breath visible in the cool air. "I spent 4 years in a room with fabric and thread, Edgar. I watched the world through a window pane. I felt like I was disappearing, piece by piece, into the silence of a life I didn't choose. When I saw your ranch, when I saw the way you were looking at it like a man at his own funeral, it reminded me of my father. He sold our land because he thought he was tired. But he found out that the only thing more tiring than working the land is having no land to work. I'm not just helping you fix a cellar. I'm reminding myself that I'm still real." She looked at him then, and the honesty in her gaze was so raw it made him want to look away. "Don't you ever feel that? Like you're just a ghost haunting your own life? Like you're waiting for someone to give you permission to stay?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the mud on their boots. "Have you ever felt like a passenger in your own story? Like you were watching your legacy crumble because you didn't think you had the right to fight for it? Tell me in the comments. What is the one thing in your life that you almost gave up on, only to realize it was the only thing that made you feel alive? We're building a community here at Redwood Chronicle for those who choose to stay, those who value the hard work of restoration over the easy path of departure." They finished the drainage line just as the noon sun began to bake the yard. As they climbed out of the cellar, covered in the gray-black silt of the Talbot foundation, a rider appeared on the horizon. It wasn't the arrogant stallion of Curtis Feld. It was a heavy work mare, and the rider was Mr. Gibbs from the general store. He looked at the two of them, muddied, exhausted, and standing side by side, and he didn't say a word about the dirt. He just handed Edgar a heavy, official-looking envelope. "Feld sent this," Gibbs said, his voice holding a note of warning. "He said if you weren't in by 3 today, the Harlan Company was moving to Plan B. I don't know what that means, Edgar, but that man has a way of making even a legal document feel like a threat." Edgar took the envelope. His fingers left a dark, muddy smear across the expensive paper. He didn't open it. He just felt the weight of it. Louise watched him, her hand resting on the handle of her shovel. She didn't ask what was inside. She didn't have to. She knew the shadow that had been hovering over the ranch since the moment her wheel broke. "The work isn't done, Edgar," she said quietly after Gibbs had ridden away. "The cellar is clear, but the garden still needs the rows turned. And that filly in the back paddock, she's been watching us all morning. She's waiting for someone to tell her who she belongs to." Edgar looked at the envelope, then at the garden, and finally at the woman who had filled his rain barrel and cleared his foundation. He realized that Curtis Feld wasn't just offering him money. He was offering him an ending. And Louise? She was offering him a beginning that required more work than he'd ever known. "The filly can wait an hour," Edgar said, his voice gravelly and firm. "But the papers have waited long enough." He walked into the house, into the study where the shadows always seemed the deepest. He sat at his father's desk. He opened the envelope. Inside was a revised contract. The price was even lower, a penalty for delay, it claimed. It was an insult disguised as an opportunity. It was the final move of a vulture who knew the prey was tired. Edgar looked at the pen. He looked at the signature line. And then he looked out the window. He saw Louise. She was at the pump again, washing the mud from her arms. The water was glistening in the sun, splashing against the dry boards of the porch. She moved with a quiet, unshakable dignity that made the fine paper in his hands feel cheap. He realized then that he wasn't a ghost. He was a Talbot, and Talbots didn't sell their souls to men in gray suits just because the rain was late. He didn't sign a contract. He didn't even put it back in the drawer. He took a match from the glass jar on the desk, struck it against the wood, and watched as the flame took hold of the Harlan Land Company's Plan B. He watched it curl and blacken, the smoke smelling of ink and old, dead plans. He didn't feel the fear he expected. He felt a clearing. If you believe that some things like honor, legacy, and the land beneath your feet are worth more than any price a corporation can offer, then you belong here with us. Join the Redwood Chronicle family. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter of Edgar and Louise's journey. We are the keepers of the digital campfire, and we need your voice to keep the stories of the frontier alive. And as we prepare for the coming storm, I want to ask you, if someone offered you a way out of all your problems, but it meant walking away from everything your family built, would you take the money? Or would you pick up the shovel? Let's talk about the price of staying in the comments. The silence that follows a fire is different from the silence that precedes it. When Edgar Talbot stood before his father's hearth and watched the last charred flakes of the Harlan Land Company's contract drift up the chimney, the room didn't just feel warmer, it felt heavier. It was the weight of a bridge burned. He was no longer a man with one foot in Wyoming and the other on a train to a nameless future. He was a man with nowhere left to go but deeper into the dirt of the Talbot Ranch. Outside, the Wyoming wind continued its endless conversation with the eaves of the house, but inside, the air had cleared. The ghost of the sale was gone, replaced by the living, breathing reality of a choice that could no longer be undone. The next morning, the reality of that choice arrived in the form of a pen and a single sheet of paper. Edgar sat at the kitchen table, the early light catching the silver in his hair, and wrote the letter that would officially end his dealings with Curtis Feld. It was a short letter, direct, as most things were in Edgar's world. He didn't offer explanations or apologies. He simply stated that the Talbot Ranch was no longer for sale and that any further communication should be directed through his attorney in Millhaven. As he sealed the envelope, he felt a strange, jarring sense of alignment. Have you ever taken a stand that you knew would bring a storm down on your head, yet you felt more at peace in that moment than you had in years of quiet safety? Tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to find the courage to say no when the whole world was telling you that yes was the only way to survive? We want to hear about those moments where you chose your legacy over a quick exit. Louise was at the stove when he finished, the smell of frying salt pork and fresh coffee filling the room. She didn't ask to read the letter. She didn't have to. She saw the way Edgar held his shoulders, no longer slumped under the invisible weight of the Harlan contract, but square and set. "I'll take it to Gibbs when I head to the mercantile," she said, her voice steady and warm. "He'll make sure it gets to town on the noon stage." "Thank you, Louise," Edgar said. He looked at her, really looked at her in the morning light. She was wearing her work trousers again, her braid pinned tight, her sleeves already rolled up. She looked like a woman who was ready for a day of labor. And for the first time, Edgar realized that her presence wasn't just a help. It was a transformation. "I was thinking about what you said, about the land resting. If we're going to wake it up, we're going to need more than just the two of us. I'm going to ride over to the Nunez place this afternoon. Dell and Cord are good hands, and with the drought hitting the South Valley, they might be looking for steady work." Louise nodded. a look of approval crossing her face. A ranch is a community, Edgar. It's not just a person and a piece of dirt. It's the hands that hold the tools and the hearts that care about the harvest. Hiring the Nunez brothers is a smart move. They know this country. The ride to the Nunez place was a long, hot 4 miles, but for Edgar, it was a ride of purpose. He found Dell and Court working on a broken reaper in their yard, their faces streaked with oil and the red dust of the valley. They were brothers by blood and by temperament, quiet, methodical, and possessed of a physical strength that seemed to come from the very bedrock of Wyoming. "I hear you burned the papers, Edgar," Dell said, not looking up from the reaper's gear assembly. The news had traveled fast, as it always did in a small town. Edgar didn't mind. "I did. And I'm looking for hands who want to help me rebuild what's left. It won't be easy work, and the pay might be thin for the first few months, but you'll have a place at my table and a horse under your saddle." The brothers exchanged a look, the kind of silent communication that only comes from years of working side by side. Then, Court stood up and wiped his hands on a greasy rag. "We've watched that ranch of yours for 3 years, Edgar," Court said. "We've watched the fences sag and the cattle thin. But we also saw the woman arrive. We saw her filling your rain barrel when the sky was clear. Any man who has the sense to listen to a woman like that is a man we can work for. We'll be there at sunup tomorrow," Dell added. Returning to the ranch with the promise of help felt like the second half of the miracle. Edgar found Louise in the kitchen garden, her hands deep in the soil she had been watering so faithfully. She was planting the tomato seedlings he had bought in town, delicate, green things that looked far too fragile for the harsh Wyoming climate. But as she tucked them into the earth, she did so with a tenderness that made Edgar believe they would survive. "They'll need shade for the first few days," she said, sensing him behind her. "The sun is going to be cruel this week." "The Nunez brothers are coming," Edgar said. "Tomorrow at dawn." Louise looked up at him, a smile touching her eyes. "Then tomorrow is the day the real work begins." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the bighorns and the valley turned a deep, bruised purple, they sat on the porch and watched the light change. The silence of the ranch was no longer the silence of a grave. It was the silence of a house that was waiting for the morning. "I spent years thinking that staying was a failure," Edgar said, his voice low. "I thought that if I couldn't make it work the way it was, the only thing to do was leave. But I realize now that I wasn't just leaving the problems. I was leaving the only place that knew my name." "Home isn't just where you're born, Edgar," Louise said, her hand finding his on the armrest. "It's the place you choose to stay when the staying is hard. It's the place where you decide that the dirt is worth the sweat." The big question of the Talbot Ranch was no longer if it would survive, but how. The Harlan Land Company would not go away quietly. Curtis Feld was a man built on the acquisition of other people's failures, and he wouldn't take kindly to a man who had chosen to succeed in spite of him. But as Edgar looked at Louise, and then at the dark, silent fields of his ancestors, he felt a strength he hadn't known since he was a boy watching his father break the first sod of spring. If you've ever felt like your home was more than just a house, like it was a part of your soul that you couldn't imagine living without, then you're part of the Redwood Chronicle community. We believe in the power of staying. We believe in the strength of the frontier spirit. If this chapter has touched your heart, let us know by hitting that like button. It tells the algorithm that stories of resilience and redemption still matter in a world that's always looking for the quickest exit. And before we turn in for the night, I want to ask you, if you were in Edgar's position and the Nunez brothers said they were joining you because of the woman they saw at your gate, would you feel humbled or proud? How much of our success is really our own? And how much is the reflection of the people we choose to keep close? Let's dive into the psychology of character in the comments below. We are just beginning to see the true strength of the Talbot Ranch. The brothers arrive tomorrow, and the Harlan Company's Plan B is lurking in the shadows. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you're there when the first post hole is dug in the next chapter. The arrival of Dell and Court Nunez at dawn was the first sign to the rest of Powder River County that the Talbot Ranch wasn't just dying a slow death anymore. It was putting up a fight. They arrived on two massive work mares, the ground vibrating under the weight of animals that had spent their lives pulling plows and hauling stone. They didn't come for the scenery, and they certainly didn't come for the conversation. They came because they had heard the match strike. They had heard that Edgar Talbot had looked a man from the Harlan Land Company in the eye and told him his money wasn't good enough to buy a man's history. Dell and Court were men of iron and silence. They understood the language of a ranch better than they understood the language of people. As they shook Edgar's hand and then Louise's, there was a brief moment of assessment, a pause where the air seemed to hold its breath. A woman on a ranch in 1883 was nothing new, but a woman who stood in the yard with a shovel in her hand and a ledger in her mind was a different kind of animal. The brothers took her measure, saw the way her boots were caked in the same mud as Edgar's, and they simply nodded. It was the only contract they needed. The work that followed was a symphony of reconstruction. For 3 years, the drainage channels along the south field had been clogging, turning good water into a swamp of silt and reeds while the roots of the grass went thirsty just 20 yards away. Edgar, Dell, and Court spent the first week knee-deep in that black, sulfur-smelling mud, their backs aching under a sun that seemed determined to punish them for trying to change the land's mind. But Louise was there, too. She wasn't just bringing water and sandwiches. She was the one mapping the flow. She had a surveyor's eye for the slope of the earth, identifying exactly where the blockages began and where the new channels needed to bite into the sod to ensure the water reached the cattle. "You're not just moving dirt, boys," she would say, her voice cutting through the humid air. "You're building the ranch's veins. If the water doesn't move, the heart stops." Have you ever looked at a problem in your life and realized it wasn't just one big catastrophe, but 1,000 small, neglected tasks that had finally piled up? Tell me in the comments. What was the vein in your life that you finally had to clear out to get things moving again? Was it a relationship, a career, or a dream you'd let get buried in the mud? We love hearing your stories of restoration. By July, the barn roof was the next priority. The old cedar shakes had grown thin and brittle, leaking every time the Wyoming sky decided to open up. Edgar drove the wagon into Millhaven 3 times, returning with loads of fresh, sweet-smelling lumber that cost him more than he liked to think about. But every time he looked at Louise helping the Nunez brothers hoist those heavy beams into place, the price didn't matter. He was no longer counting his life in dollars and cents. He was counting it in the weight of things that would last. One Tuesday evening, the heat finally broke with a sudden, cooling breeze that smelled of distant rain in the mountains. Edgar and Louise were in the tack room at the back of the barn, sorting through years of accumulated junk, broken saddles, rusted bits, and crates of forgotten history. They were looking for a specific set of harness oil when Louise pushed aside a heavy, overturned saddle tree and found a small wooden crate tucked into the shadows. It was his mother's things. Edgar sat down on an overturned crate, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the lid. The room smelled of old leather and the faint, lingering scent of lavender. Inside were books with spines cracked from years of reading, letters written in his father's clumsy but earnest hand, and a small, oval portrait in a plain wooden frame. He held the portrait up to the lantern light. It was his parents in the early years of the ranch, standing in front of the original cabin. They were young, younger than he was now. His father was staring into the camera with a look of fierce, quiet pride, and his mother was leaning into him, her hand on his arm, a soft, secret smile on her face. "They look happy," Louise said softly, sitting beside him. She didn't try to take the portrait. She just watched it with him. "They were," Edgar whispered. "Most of the time. It wasn't an easy life. The winters were long, and the market was always trying to take what they had. But they chose each other every single morning. And they chose this place." He ran his thumb over the edge of the frame, the dust of 30 years coming away in a gray smudge. "I think that's what I forgot, Louise. I forgot about the choosing. I spent 3 years feeling like this ranch was a cage, like I was stuck here because I didn't know how to leave. But looking at them, I realized they stayed because they wanted to be here. They stayed because this dirt meant something to them." He turned to look at her, the warmth of her shoulder against his, the smell of the summer evening around them. The big question that had been haunting him, The one about whether a man can truly come back from the brink found its answer in the silence of that tack room. "I love you, Louise," he said. It wasn't a grand declaration. It was a simple statement of fact, as clear and undeniable as the mountains on the horizon. "I want you to know that, not because I'm asking for anything, but because it's true, and because I think you deserve to know that someone is choosing you." Right here, in the middle of all this dust and work. Louise was quiet for a long beat. Her eyes were dark and steady, reflecting the yellow light of the lantern. Then, she reached out and took his hand. Her palm was rough, just like his, but her touch was the softest thing he'd ever felt. "I love you too, Edgar," she said. "I've loved you since the day you put your shoulder to my wagon. I was just waiting to be sure you knew why you were staying before I said it back. I didn't want to be the reason you stayed if you were still looking for a way out." "I'm not looking for a way out anymore," Edgar said. "I'm looking for the way in." They sat in the tack room for a long time, the portrait of the past resting on their knees, while the future began to take shape in the darkness. Have you ever reached a point in your life where you realized the person standing next to you wasn't just a partner, but the very reason you were able to see the light again? If you found that kind of choosing in your own life, give this video a like. It helps us know that the message of the frontier, the message of loyalty and love, is still reaching the people who need to hear it. The proposal came in August on the porch after a long day of branding. The fireflies were just starting to wink in the low grass beyond the fence, and the evening star was a brilliant, solitary diamond in the western sky. Edgar didn't have a ring. He hadn't bought one in town because he didn't know what she would want, and he didn't want to presume. "I want to ask you something," he said, sitting in the chair beside her. "I suspect I know what it is," Louise said, a playful spark in her eyes. "I don't have a ring," he admitted, his face turning a deep red in the twilight. "I didn't know if you'd want gold or silver, or if you'd even want one at all." Louise laughed, a rich, warm sound that filled the porch. "Edgar Talbot, if I wanted jewelry, I wouldn't be working a ranch in Powder River County. If you want to give me something as a token, you can let me pick out the curtain fabric for the kitchen window. Because the ones your mother left? Well, they've seen better decades." "Is that a yes?" he asked, leaning forward. "Yes, Edgar," she said, her voice dropping into that low, resonant tone that always made his heart skip a beat. "That is a yes." They were married in September by Reverend Cole, a broad-shouldered man who rode through the territory twice a year with a Bible in his saddlebag and a song in his heart. The ceremony was held right there on the grass in front of the house, with the Bighorn Mountains as their witness and the Nunez brothers standing as their kin. Louise wore a dress she'd made herself, a deep blue-gray wool that made her eyes look like the sky before a storm. She had woven dried wildflowers into her hair, and when she walked toward him across the yard, Edgar felt like the luckiest man who had ever lived. The celebration wasn't elaborate, but it was real. Mr. Gibbs brought a bottle of the good whiskey from the store, and Mrs. Harrow brought 2 apple pies that smelled of heaven. Dell and Court were persuaded to bring out their guitars, and as the moon rose over the valley, the sound of music and laughter filled the Talbot ranch for the first time in a generation. As the guests finally rolled away in their wagons, Edgar and Louise stood on the porch, watching the stars. "Home," Edgar said, the word finally feeling like it belonged to him. "Home," Louise agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder. If you've enjoyed this chapter of our story, make sure you're subscribed to Redwood Chronicle. The ranch is rebuilt, the union is sealed, but the frontier is never truly finished. We're moving into the first winter of their marriage next. And as anyone who has lived in Wyoming knows, the winter is where the true testing begins. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter of this frontier saga. And before we move on, I have to ask you, do you think the Harlan Land Company is truly gone? Or is Curtis Feld the kind of man who waits for the first snow to make his next move? What would you do if a vulture was still circling your home? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. The first autumn of their marriage was a season of silver frost and golden ambition. The Wyoming wind, which had once sounded like a funeral dirge to Edgar Talbot, now seemed to carry the sharp, clean scent of opportunity. There's a specific kind of alchemy that happens when two people who have spent their lives working in isolation finally find a partner who matches their stride. Edgar had spent years dragging the weight of the ranch behind him like a ball and chain, but with Louise beside him, he discovered the multiplying effect of shared intention. They didn't just do twice the work. They did work that mattered twice as much. They were no longer just surviving the land. They were building a kingdom out of the dust. In October, just as the first dusting of snow began to whiten the peaks of the Bighorns, Edgar made a move that signaled to the entire county that the Talbot Ranch was back in the business of growth. He rode over to the next county to meet with a rancher he'd known since he was a boy, a man who dealt in sturdy, mountain-bred stock that didn't shrivel when the mercury dropped. He bought 12 additional head of cattle. Not a massive herd, but 12 healthy, thick-coated animals that would form the new core of his operation. He and the Nunez brothers drove them home over 2 long, grueling days. They camped one night on the trail, the stars overhead looking like scattered diamonds on black velvet. As Edgar sat by the campfire, wrapped in his duster and listening to the rhythmic breathing of the cattle, he realized he wasn't looking at the horizon for an escape. He was looking at his watch, wondering if Louise had managed to get the new green curtains hung in the kitchen. When he finally crested the last rise and saw the ranch house nestled in the valley, a thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney like a welcoming hand, he felt a surge of warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. Louise was in the doorway, the light from the kitchen spilling out behind her. The green curtains were indeed hung, a practical, dark forest green that made the whole house look settled and loved. "You're late," she said as he dismounted, her voice holding that low, teasing, resonant tone he had come to crave. "The cattle have a mind of their own," Edgar replied, pulling her into a brief, dusty embrace. "But the house looks different from the road, Louise. It looks like it's actually occupied by someone who intends to stay." "That's because it is, Edgar. Now come inside. The beef stew has been waiting an hour, and I suspect you're more dirt than man right now." Have you ever experienced that moment of homecoming where the very air of your house feels changed? Tell me in the comments. What is the one small thing, like a new set of curtains or a lit fire, that truly made your house feel like a home for the first time? We're exploring the heart of the frontier here, and your stories are what keep the campfire burning. But Louise hadn't just been hanging curtains while he was away. With her characteristic practicality, she had identified a flaw in the root cellar drainage that both Edgar and the Nunez brothers had missed. She had ridden into Millhaven, consulted with the agricultural supply man, and returned with a package of seeds for an expanded garden and a plan for a new orchard. "We need to think about the south-facing slope," she said that evening, spreading her journal across the kitchen table. It was the same journal she used for the ranch accounts, now expanding into a detailed record of their dreams. "The soil there is deep, and the sun stays long after the valley goes dark. 12 apple trees and 6 pear trees would give us enough to put up for the winter and still have some to trade to the mercantile. A ranch shouldn't just be about beef, Edgar. It should be about everything the earth is willing to give." Edgar looked at her, at the way the lamplight caught the determination in her eyes, and he knew better than to argue. He realized then that he had married a woman who didn't just see the ranch as it was, but as it could be in 10 years, in 20. She was building a legacy while he was still busy fixing the fences. Then came the winter. Wyoming winters don't arrive with a whisper, they arrive with a roar. By mid-November, the world had gone very quiet and very white. The snow drifted to the eaves of the barn, and the wind became a physical force that rattled the window panes and tested the integrity of every board his father had ever nailed. But the Talbot Ranch was ready. The woodpile was stacked high, the cattle were sheltered, and the root cellar was bulging with the harvest Louise had coaxed from the soil. Being snowbound with Louise was an entirely different experience from the suffocating isolation Edgar had endured the previous 2 years. He remembered sitting in that same kitchen, drinking whiskey alone and watching the shadows grow long, feeling like the silence was a predator waiting to swallow him. Now, the silence was a companion. Louise taught him a card game she had learned from a Ute woman back in Colorado. They would sit across the table from each other for hours, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the occasional snap of a card against the wood. Edgar lost most of the time. Louise was a strategic thinker who could see 3 moves ahead while he was still looking at his hand, but he found he didn't mind. The losing was just an excuse to stay in her presence a little longer. They talked about things he had never spoken of with another living soul. He told her about the fear he'd felt when his father died, the terrifying realization that the world didn't care if the Talbot name survived or not. She told him about the quiet suffocation of her years as a seamstress, the way the 4 walls of her shop had begun to feel like a cage. "We're both survivors of the same storm, Edgar," she said one night, her hand resting on his as the wind howled outside. "We just had different ways of hiding from the rain." It was during one of those long, snowbound evenings in January that the world shifted again. The card game was between them, the coffee in their cups was long cold, and the fire had burned down to a deep, glowing red. Louise set her hand down, but she didn't call the game. She looked at him with a careful steadiness, her hands folded around her cup. "Edgar," she said quietly, "I think we're going to need to start thinking about the small room upstairs. The one your father used for his tack." Edgar felt a jolt of electricity run down his spine. He looked at her, his heart hammering a rhythm he hadn't felt since the day her wagon wheel broke. "The small room? Why?" "Because," she said, a soft, vulnerable light entering her eyes, "I think by October, it isn't going to be empty anymore. I think the Talbot Ranch is about to have a new hand. A very small one." Edgar didn't move for a long beat. He couldn't. The magnitude of the statement was too large for the room. He had been a man ready to vanish, a man ready to let his family tree end in a pile of corporate ash. And now, he looked at the woman who had changed every plan, and he felt a love so absolute it was almost frightening. He stood up, walked around the table, and crouched beside her chair. He took her hands in his, the same strong, capable hands that had helped him rebuild the east fence, and he pressed his forehead against hers. "Louise," he whispered, "I have never been so happy in all my born days. Even if the timing is inconvenient," she teased, though her voice was thick with emotion. "October is harvest time, Edgar. I'll be a poor hand for the heavy lifting." "There is no inconvenient timing for this," he said, pulling back to look at her. "Not for us. Not here. We'll hire more help. We'll bring in Mrs. Harrow if we have to. But this place, it was built for children, Louise. My father didn't build this house for a ghost. He built it for exactly this. Do you believe that the arrival of a child is the ultimate pattern interrupt in a family story? How did your own life change when you realized you were no longer just living for yourself, but for the generation that would follow? If you felt that terrifying joy Edgar is experiencing, hit that like button. We're celebrating the continuation of legacies here at Redwood Chronicle. The news of the baby changed the way they worked as the spring thaw arrived. Edgar became a man possessed. He worked with the Nunez brothers to double the cattle herd again, making inquiries with ranchers as far as the next territory. He didn't just want a stable operation anymore. He wanted an empire for his son or daughter to inherit. The orchard was planted in June. 12 apple trees and 6 pear trees, small and green and promising, lining the south slope. Louise worked steadily through her pregnancy, adjusting her pace, but never stopping. She was the one who managed the accounts for the purchase of the Henderson land, 200 acres to the east that had finally come on the market. If we buy the Henderson place, we control the entire drainage system for the valley, Louise argued at the kitchen table. It makes us a real operation, Edgar. Not just a ranch, but a power. It's a lot of debt, Louise. It's a lot of land, Edgar. And we have the numbers to support it. Look, she pointed to her ledger, her precise, shaded handwriting proving that her vision was backed by a math he couldn't deny. They made the offer in June. It was accepted. The deed for the expanded Talbot Ranch was signed on a Tuesday morning at the land office in Millhaven, the same office Edgar had ridden past without stopping 2 years ago with a surrender in his pocket. He stood at the counter, Louise beside him with her hand over his on the pen, and he felt the full weight of the contrast. He wasn't giving up. He was doubling down. William James Talbot was born on a bright October morning in 1884. He arrived with the same determination his mother possessed, delivered by Dr. Whitfield as the first leaves of the cottonwoods turned to gold. Edgar stood outside the door, leaning against the wall with his hat pressed to his chest, listening to the first cry of his son. It was the loudest, most beautiful sound that had ever echoed through the timber of the Talbot house. When he finally went in and saw Louise with the wrapped bundle in her arms, his knees felt weak. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, a tiny, wrinkled person with Edgar's ears and Louise's steady gaze. "Home," Louise said, her voice rough with exhaustion. "He's home, Edgar." "He is," Edgar agreed, taking his son into his arms for the first time. "And he's never going to have to wonder if this land belongs to him." The Talbot Ranch in 1885 was a different world. The herd was strong, the orchard was growing, and the sounds of a child filled the rooms that had been silent for so long. They had survived the winter. They had survived the drought. And they had survived the man they used to be. The autumn of 1888 didn't arrive with a whisper on the Talbot Ranch. It arrived with the steady, rhythmic beat of a growing heartbeat and the smell of ripening apples. It had been 5 years since the morning Edgar Talbot had stood in a dusty, silent kitchen with the papers of surrender in his pocket. Now, that same kitchen was a whirlwind of light, the smell of fresh yeast, and the chaotic, beautiful sounds of a life that refused to be small. William was 4 years old now, a sturdy, dark-haired boy with Louise's quiet determination and Edgar's observant eyes. He spent his mornings supervising Dell and Court Nunez as they worked the stock, his small hands already learning the feel of a lead rope and the correct way to approach a nervous foal. But as the leaves on the cottonwoods along the North Creek began to turn that deep, translucent gold, the house shifted its focus once more. Clara Jane Talbot was born on a crisp October morning, delivered into a world that was ready for her in a way it hadn't been for her father. She arrived with dark hair, exactly the color of Louise's, and a temperament that was, from the very first hour, a mirror of Edgar's quiet steadiness. While William had spent his infancy challenging the silence with his volume, Clara Jane seemed to regard the world with a focused, analytical gaze. She was a child who held on. When William offered her his finger, she gripped it with a surprising firmness that earned his immediate, protective devotion. "She holds on," he told Edgar with considerable respect. "She's a Talbot woman," Edgar had replied, his heart swelling with a pride he no longer tried to hide. "She'll hold on to what's hers." By the time the Henderson land was fully integrated in the late 1880s, the Talbot Ranch had become one of the most respected operations in Powder River County. It wasn't the largest. Edgar had no interest in being a land baron, but it was known for having the best managed grass and the hardiest stock. The addition of the 200 acres to the east had linked the drainage systems they had built, ensuring that even in the driest Wyoming summers, the Talbot cattle had water. The orchard on the south slope was in its 5th year now, the small, green trees they had planted with such care finally offering a real harvest. Louise spent her afternoons in the kitchen, putting up jars of apple butter that would glow like amber on the shelves of the Millhaven Mercantile. Have you ever looked at something you built with your own hands, a garden, a family, or a business, and realized that the hard work wasn't just in the doing, but in the choosing to stay when everyone else was leaving? Tell me in the comments. What is the legacy you're building today that you hope your children or grandchildren will one day hold on to? We're a community that believes in the long-term value of the land and the spirit, and your stories are the fuel for our fire. The years between 1888 and 1891 were years of deepening. The Nunez brothers were no longer just hands. They were the pillars of the operation. Dell had married Amara, a woman from town with a laugh that could be heard from the south paddock, and they had a son of their own. Court remained a bachelor, a patient, quiet man who had become the unofficial uncle to the Talbot children, carving wooden horses and teaching William how to read the clouds for a coming storm. The ranch felt full. It felt like a community, a digital campfire brought to life in the timber and stone of the Wyoming hills. Thomas arrived in 1891, the final piece of the Talbot puzzle. He was a boy of immediate opinion and impressive volume, a child who seemed to believe the frontier had been created specifically for his amusement. He arrived into a ranch that was running like a well-oiled machine, into a family that had room for him in every sense of the word. Clara, now 3, regarded him with a mixture of amusement and resignation, while William, 7 and already a serious ranch hand in training, took his responsibility as the eldest with a gravity that made Edgar smile. On a late November evening in 1892, with the first serious cold of the season settling over the valley, Edgar found Louise sitting on the porch. The children were finally settled. Clara reading by the fire, William studying a map with Court, and Thomas asleep in the cradle Edgar had built with his own hands. The mountains were doing what they always did at that hour, holding the last of the light in their peaks while the valley went dark below. The air smelled of wood smoke and the dry grass of a successful harvest. Edgar sat beside his wife, and she leaned against his side, her hand finding his in the dark. "I was thinking about the road," Edgar said quietly, his voice a low rumble in the stillness. "The day the wheel broke?" Louise asked. "Yeah, I was riding past that gate with the Harlan papers in my pocket. I was 5 minutes away from being a man who didn't exist anymore. If all had held, if you had made it past that stretch of road without trouble, I would have filed those papers. I would have been in California within a month. I would have been a ghost haunting someone else's city." Louise was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled inside the house, a warm, orange glow spilling out onto the porch boards. "But you didn't file them, Edgar. You had days to go back. You had weeks while I was working for Gillian Town. You didn't go back. I needed the wheel to break, Louise. I needed to hear your voice in that moment to remember what I was actually walking away from. I had convinced myself that staying was a failure, but you taught me that staying is the only way to win." Louise looked at him, her eyes dark and steady, reflecting the stars that were beginning to populate the Wyoming sky. "Maybe the wheel breaking was just the wheel breaking, Edgar. And the rest of it, the choosing, that was all you." Edgar Talbot had planned to sell the ranch and leave. He had planned to disappear into the gray fog of a life without roots. But a woman had arrived on a broken wheel, and she had filled his rain barrel, and she had looked at his neglected land and seen a future where he only saw a past. She had challenged him to pick up the shovel when he wanted to pick up the pen, and in the end, he had burned the papers of surrender and built a kingdom instead. He looked at his wife, at the house his father had built, and at the land that was now truly home. He realized that the frontier wasn't a place you went to find yourself. It was the place you stayed to build yourself. The broken wheel wasn't a disaster. It was a pivot. It was the moment destiny decided that the Talbot name wasn't finished yet. If this journey of redemption and restoration has touched your heart, if it reminds you that it's never too late to change the plan and fight for what you love, then help us keep the Redwood Chronicle alive. You've been part of this journey from the snap of that wood in Chapter 1 to the peace of this porch in Chapter 9. Drop a final comment telling us what part of Edgar and Louise's story resonated with you the most. Was it the work on the fence, the discovery in the tack room, or the moment the papers burned? Your engagement tells the world that stories of honor and resilience still matter. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this epic saga with someone who needs to know that their good bones are still there, just waiting for the right person to see them. The wind came off the mountains that night, cold and clean and wild. Edgar breathed it in, his wife's hand in his, and felt the absolute weight of a life that had come true. Not the life he had planned, a better one, a life built on a broken wheel and a shared choice. He was home, and he wasn't going anywhere. This concludes the epic story of Edgar Talbot and Louise Bishop. Let me know if you are ready for the next frontier journey, or if there is anything else you'd like to explore in the Redwood Chronicle.